The story of Meyer Lansky begins not in the glitzy casinos of Havana or the back rooms of powerful crime families, but in the impoverished, cobblestone streets of Grodno, in the Russian Empire, a world defined by its pervasive fear and brutal oppression. Born Meyer Lansky on July 4, 1902, his earliest memories were not of playgrounds or childish games, but of the constant, looming threat of pogroms, state-sanctioned, violent attacks against Jewish communities like his own. This environment forged in the young boy a fundamental understanding of the world, that power was the only true currency, and that without it, you were merely a victim waiting for your turn to be persecuted. His father, Max, was a struggling textile worker, and the world they inhabited was one of bleak prospects and limited horizons, a place where dreams were a luxury few could afford. In 1911, seeking escape from this relentless cycle of poverty and fear, the Lansky family made the monumental decision to emigrate, joining the great wave of millions seeking a new life in America. They arrived at Ellis Island, that great gateway of hope and transformation, and it was here that Meyer Lansky began his reinvention, his name officially anglicized to Meyer Lansky. They settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a teeming, vibrant, and overcrowded melting pot of immigrants, each group fighting for its own small piece of the American dream. The streets were just as tough as those in Grodno, but the nature of the struggle was different. Here, the enemy wasn't a czarist regime, but a system of economic hardship and territorial gang warfare. Young Meyer, small for his age, but possessing a fierce and preternatural intelligence, quickly learned that physical strength alone was not enough to survive. He was a brilliant student, particularly in mathematics, where he found a world of order and logic that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic reality of his surroundings. Numbers made sense to him in a way people often did not. They were predictable, they could be manipulated, and they always told a clear, unemotional story. This aptitude would become the cornerstone of his entire life, the key that would unlock doors to unimaginable power. It was on these very streets that he had his fateful encounter with another young boy, a rugged and fiercely ambitious Italian immigrant named Salvatore Lucania, who would later become known to the world as Charles Lucky Luciano. Theirs was an unlikely friendship, a meeting of two different worlds, Lansky, the quiet, cerebral strategist, and Luciano, the bold, charismatic street brawler. They recognized in each other a complementary strength, a shared hunger for something more than the grime and poverty of their childhoods. They started small, running errands for older gangsters, learning the intricate hierarchies and unspoken rules of the criminal underworld. Lansky's first major venture was a simple but effective protection racket, targeting the local Jewish pushcart vendors. But his mind was already working on a larger scale. He saw the disjointed, chaotic nature of street crime as inefficient. It was a series of small, violent transactions with no long-term vision. While others were focused on the next score, Lansky was thinking about structure, about syndication, about turning this unruly mob of thugs and thieves into a well-oiled corporate enterprise. He, along with Luciano and a growing circle of trusted associates like Benjamin, Bugsy, Siegel, another young Jewish kid with a volcanic temper and a sharp eye for opportunity, began to consolidate power. They formed a multi-ethnic alliance that was revolutionary for its time, breaking down the old world prejudices that had kept the Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs perpetually at war with each other. This was the birth of the National Crime Syndicate, a concept championed by Lansky's brilliant, calculating mind. He understood that cooperation and a centralized board of directors were far more profitable than constant, bloody turf wars. The era of Prohibition, which began in 1920, was the catalyst that launched this nascent syndicate into the stratosphere of wealth and influence. The Volstead Act, which banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, was, in Lansky's eyes, not a law, but a magnificent business opportunity, handed to them by the government itself. He applied his mathematical genius to the complex logistics of bootlegging, creating a vast, intricate network for smuggling, distillation, and distribution. He wasn't the one driving the trucks or unloading the barrels of Canadian whiskey. He was the one calculating the profit margins, negotiating deals with corrupt officials, and finding ingenious ways to launder the staggering sums of cash that began to flow in. He established front companies, invested in legitimate businesses like laundries, a perfect metaphor for his real work, and built a financial empire that was as robust as it was invisible. It was during this time that he earned his enduring nickname, the mob's accountant, but this was a profound underestimation of his role. He was not merely a bookkeeper. He was the chief financial officer, the strategic mastermind, the architect of the entire economic infrastructure of organized crime in America. He ensured that every partner got their fair share, that disputes were settled with a balance sheet rather than a bullet whenever possible, and that the money was not just hoarded, but put to work, creating more money. This was the first chapter of his rise, a quiet, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient ascent from a frightened boy in a Russian shtetl to the most powerful man no one had ever heard of, all before he had even reached the age of 30. The sheer scale of the wealth generated by Prohibition was unprecedented in the annals of American crime, a roaring river of untaxed, unregulated cash that needed to be channeled, controlled, and most importantly, concealed from the prying eyes of the government. While the public face of bootlegging was often the flamboyant speakeasy owner or the ruthless enforcer, Meyer Lansky operated in the soundless, deep waters of high finance. A realm he understood was far more critical to long-term survival than any display of brute force. His partnership with Lucky Luciano evolved into the strategic backbone of the entire underworld, a symbiotic relationship where Luciano's political cunning and ambition to reorganize the Mafia were perfectly complemented by Lansky's financial acumen and visionary planning. It was Lansky who conceived of the concept of a centralized bank for the mob, a communal treasury that could fund ambitious new ventures, pay for the best legal defense money could buy, and provide for the families of associates who were imprisoned or killed. This wasn't just a war chest. It was the financial engine for a shadow government, and Lansky was its undisputed Secretary of the Treasury. He began to weave a complex web of shell corporations and holding companies, his laundries and garment businesses, now joined by legitimate-looking ventures in real estate, manufacturing, and the stock market. He understood the fundamental principle that would define modern financial crime. To hide illegal profit, you must first commingle it with legitimate capital, creating a labyrinth so dense that following the money trail becomes a near impossible task for any investigator. This period also saw the refinement of his most crucial skill, the art of corruption. Lansky did not see law enforcement as an enemy to be defeated, but as a business expense to be managed. He cultivated relationships with police officers, judges, politicians, and union leaders, not with intimidation, but with cold, hard cash. He built a vast intelligence network, often knowing about police raids before the officers who were supposed to carry them out. His calm, businesslike demeanor was his greatest asset in these negotiations. He was not a thug. He was a businessman offering a mutually beneficial transaction, and this approach made him far more effective and less suspect than his more volatile peers. The end of Prohibition in 1933 was seen as a catastrophe by many bootleggers, but Lansky viewed it as a market correction, a signal to pivot and diversify the Syndicate's portfolio. He had already anticipated the dry pipeline and was prepared with the next great venture, gambling. He saw the human desire to wager not as a vice, but as a perpetual recession-proof industry. His first major foray was the creation of a sprawling, sophisticated wire service that provided up to the minute racing results to illegal bookmaking operations across the country, effectively nationalizing sports betting and taking a cut of every single transaction. But his vision extended far beyond backroom betting parlors. He, along with his fiercely loyal friend Bugsy Siegel, looked to the west, to the barren desert oasis of Las Vegas, a place where gambling was not just tolerated but legal. While Siegel is often credited with building the famous Flamingo Hotel, it was Lansky's financial backing and strategic oversight that truly brought the project to life. Channeling syndicate money from the East Coast into the foundation of what would become the world's most famous casino strip. Simultaneously, he cast his gaze south to the tropical island of Cuba, a country steeped in corruption and just a short flight from the Florida coast. He saw in Cuba the potential for something even grander than Vegas, a fully integrated gambling and resort paradise, a legal haven where the mob could operate in the open, catering to wealthy American tourists. He began traveling to Havana, and with his impeccable manners and sophisticated air, he ingratiated himself with the country's brutal and corrupt president, Fulgencio Batista. Their partnership was a masterpiece of cynical realpolitik. Batista needed the revenue to maintain his grip on power, and Lansky needed the official protection to build his empire. He negotiated a deal that gave the Syndicate virtual control of Havana's gambling scene, and he personally oversaw the operations of the luxurious Hotel National Casino, transforming it into a model of efficiency and profit. He instituted revolutionary concepts in casino management, using his mathematical mind to perfect the odds on every game, training dealers to be impeccably honest in their dishonesty, and creating systems to identify and thwart card counters long before it became standard practice. He understood that the house's edge was a mathematical certainty, and his role was to ensure that this certainty played out smoothly, night after night, without scandal or disruption. The money that flowed from Cuba was even greater than the Prohibition bootleg funds, and it was all perfectly legal under Cuban law. By the late 1940s, Meyer Lansky, the quiet boy from the Lower East Side, effectively controlled a multinational corporation with interests in gambling, real estate, banking, and numerous legitimate fronts. His influence stretching from the council chambers of New York City to the presidential palace in Havana, all while maintaining the public persona of a simple, retiring businessman who owned a few minor interests here and there. The glittering empire built on Cuban sand, however, was destined to be tested by the very volatility of human ambition and geopolitical shifts that Lansky had always sought to buffer through financial planning. The first major crack in the foundation appeared not from external law enforcement, but from within the innermost circle of his trusted allies, a betrayal that would shake the Syndicate to its core and demonstrate the brutal cost of deviating from Lansky's carefully calculated path. Bugsy, Siegel, the charismatic and handsome partner who had been like a brother to Lansky since their childhood on the Lower East Side, was the point of failure. Siegel had been the ground visionary for the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, but his management of the project was a case study in everything Lansky despised: emotional, profligate, and dangerously undisciplined. The construction costs for the Flamingo spiraled into the millions, far exceeding the initial budget, with rumors swirling that Siegel and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, were skimming from the Syndicate's funds. Lansky, who had provided a significant portion of the capital from the National Crime Bank, repeatedly sent warnings to his old friend, urging fiscal restraint and a focus on the bottom line. But Siegel, enamored with his own celebrity and the glamour of his new Las Vegas life, dismissed these concerns, believing his personal magnetism could override the cold, hard mathematics of cost overruns. The grand opening of the Flamingo in December 1946 was a humiliating disaster plagued by bad weather, construction delays, and a lack of celebrity attendees, resulting in massive losses. For the Syndicate's board of directors, this was no longer a simple business setback. It was an unforgivable sin of mismanagement and potential theft. A meeting was convened, and despite Lansky's personal history with Siegel, his loyalty to the larger organization and its financial health had to come first. The numbers were clear, and in Lansky's world, the numbers were the final arbiter of truth. In a decision that would haunt him personally, but which he deemed necessary professionally, he did not veto the contract that was put out on his lifelong friend. On the evening of June 20th, 1947, as Siegel sat in the living room of Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion, a rifle shot through the window ended his life, a stark message to the entire underworld about the price of failure and the perils of embezzling from the collective. Lansky mourned the loss of his friend in private, but he immediately moved to secure the asset. He dispatched a new, more businesslike management team to Las Vegas to take control of the Flamingo, and within months, under his remote, meticulous guidance, the casino began turning a steady profit, proving that his model worked when executed without sentimentality. This event solidified his reputation as a man who would prioritize the stability and profitability of the enterprise above all personal attachments. A man whose calm exterior masked an iron will capable of making the most devastating decisions without a flicker of public emotion. The lesson of Bugsy Siegel was absorbed by every crime family in America. Meyer Lansky's financial advice was not a suggestion. It was a directive. Meanwhile, the Cuban operation continued to flourish, becoming a veritable money-making machine that seemed immune to the economic fluctuations of the mainland. Lansky's influence in Havana was now so absolute that he was referred to as the little man, in hushed, respectful tones throughout the island. He expanded his operations, building the magnificent Riviera Hotel, a project over which he exercised total control from the architectural blueprints to the thickness of the gaming tables felt. He insisted on a level of luxury that would surpass anything in Las Vegas, understanding that the experience itself was the product. He famously calculated the exact amount of oxygen to pump into the casino to keep players alert and gambling longer. And he designed the entire floor so that guests had to walk through the gambling arena to reach any of the amenities, maximizing exposure to the tables. The profits were astronomical, a river of cash that flowed back to the States, was laundered through his network of banks and businesses, and reinvested into more legitimate enterprises, further blurring the line between the criminal underworld and the legitimate economy. Yet, even as he stood at the pinnacle of his power in the late 1950s, a revolution was brewing in the mountains of Cuba, led by a bearded revolutionary named Fidel Castro, who saw the glittering casinos of Havana not as symbols of progress, but as emblems of American imperialism and the corruption of the Batista regime. Lansky, like many in Washington, initially underestimated Castro's movement, believing Batista's military could contain the rebellion. It was a rare but catastrophic miscalculation. On New Year's Day 1959, Batista fled the country, and Castro's revolutionary forces marched into Havana. The mob's paradise evaporated almost overnight. Castro's new government immediately nationalized the casinos, denouncing them as tools of gangsters, and Lansky, along with every other American mobster, was forced to flee the island, leaving behind assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The fall of Cuba was a financial body blow from which the Syndicate never fully recovered, a stark reminder that even the most brilliant criminal mind was vulnerable to the unpredictable tides of history and revolution. The staggering loss of his Cuban empire did not spell the end for Meyer Lansky. Instead, it initiated the most complex and perilous chapter of his life, one defined not by expansion and acquisition, but by a relentless, defensive war of attrition against the full might of the United States government. The revolution in Havana was more than a financial catastrophe. It was a geopolitical earthquake that shattered his primary revenue stream and exposed the Syndicate's over-reliance on a single, fragile foreign regime, forced to retreat to his base in the United States. Lansky now found the domestic landscape radically transformed. The era of quiet toleration and systemic corruption that had allowed him to operate with such impunity was drawing to a close, replaced by a new, zealous determination in Washington to finally dismantle organized crime. The man who embodied this new crusade was a young and ambitious Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, who saw the mob not as a collection of local gangsters, but as a clear and present danger to the nation itself. And he considered Meyer Lansky, the hidden architect of its financial power, to be public enemy number one. Kennedy launched an unprecedented legal assault, mobilizing the entire apparatus of the Justice Department, the FBI, and the Internal Revenue Service with a single, focused objective to put Lansky in prison. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, who for decades had been notoriously reluctant to even acknowledge the existence of a national crime syndicate, now placed Lansky under constant and intrusive surveillance. His phones were tapped. His movements were tailed by a rotating team of federal agents. And his every financial transaction was scrutinized with forensic intensity. This was no longer the casual harassment of local police. It was a sophisticated, well-funded, and patient campaign designed to unravel the intricate web he had spent a lifetime weaving. Lansky, ever the strategist, responded not with panic, but with a cool, calculated retreat into an even deeper layer of anonymity. He divested himself of any visible assets, operating through a labyrinth of proxies and front men, becoming a ghost in his own financial machine. He knew the government's strongest weapon was the IRS, and he dedicated his immense intellect to staying one step ahead of their tax codes, creating such Byzantine corporate structures and international money trails that even the most determined revenue agents found themselves lost in a hall of mirrors. The pressure, however, was immense and unrelenting. Old associates, facing decades in prison themselves, began to break under the strain, and the once impenetrable code of Omerta started to show cracks. The government managed to secure a minor conviction against him in 1953 for illegal gambling, which resulted in a short prison sentence, but this was a mere skirmish. The real battle was over the vast fortune they were certain he controlled. Yet, no matter how hard they looked, the government could find almost nothing. The man who had financed a global criminal enterprise appeared to live a modest, almost austere life with his second wife, Thelma, in a small, unassuming house in Miami Beach. He owned no flashy cars, no extensive property portfolio, no Swiss bank accounts that they could ever definitively prove. This was the ultimate expression of his genius. He had perfected the art of owning nothing while controlling everything. The relentless pursuit took a heavy toll on his health, exacerbating a chronic heart condition and the immense psychological strain of living under a microscope for years on end. In a desperate move to escape the pressure and perhaps reclaim a fraction of his past glory, he attempted to immigrate to Israel in 1970 under the nation's law of return, which granted citizenship to any Jew. For a brief moment, it seemed he might achieve a final, stunning escape. He settled in a Tel Aviv hotel, but the United States government immediately began intense political and legal pressure on Israel to expel him. The ensuing legal battle dragged on for 2 years, a highly publicized international spectacle that painted him as a stateless pariah. The Israeli Supreme Court ultimately ruled that due to his criminal past, he did not qualify as a Jew under the law of return, a devastating personal and philosophical blow to a man who had always identified strongly with his heritage. Forced to return to the United States in 1972, he was immediately arrested at the airport and charged with federal income tax evasion, the government's signature weapon. The subsequent trial in 1973 was the climactic showdown of his life. The prosecution, armed with decades of investigation and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, presented its case, alleging he controlled a hidden fortune worth over $300 million. Lansky, now frail and ill, sat calmly through the proceedings, his brilliant mind still sharp, following every legal maneuver. In a stunning victory that echoed his entire career, the jury found him not guilty on all counts. They concluded that the government had failed to prove its case, that it could not provide the concrete, irrefutable evidence needed to convict. He had outsmarted the system one last time. Yet, the victory was Pyrrhic. The legal battles had drained him financially and broken him physically. The empire he built was fragmented, the old Syndicate a shadow of its former self. He spent his final years in quiet obscurity in Miami Beach, a forgotten king in a tiny kingdom, dying of lung cancer on January 15, 1983. When his estate was settled, the world waited for the revelation of the hidden fortune. The final, ironic audit revealed an estate valued at just over 57,000. The mob's accountant had balanced his final books, leaving behind a legacy not of vast wealth, but of a terrifying, elusive intellect that proved, for a lifetime, that the most powerful criminal is the one you can never quite prove exists. The quiet death of Meyer Lansky in a Miami Beach hospital room was not the end of his story. It was merely the final, masterful stroke in a lifelong performance of obscurity, a performance so convincing that it continues to baffle historians, law enforcement officials, and financial forensic experts to this very day. The public revelation of his meager estate, a sum that would not have covered the annual operating budget of one of his Havana casino's high roller suites, was met with universal disbelief and a deep, lingering suspicion that this was his last and greatest con. The official narrative that the man who had laundered hundreds of millions for the most powerful criminal organization in American history had died virtually penniless seemed to defy all logic and evidence. It prompted an immediate and intense re-examination of his entire life, a posthumous audit of the legend, as investigators and biographers scrambled to find the missing fortune. to trace the ghostly outlines of the financial empire he had so carefully dissolved into the ether. They scrutinized every known associate, every shell corporation that had ever been vaguely linked to his name, every real estate transaction in Florida and New York that had his fingerprint, however faint. They looked for secret accounts in the notoriously opaque banking systems of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, for hidden stock portfolios, for diamonds or gold bullion stored in anonymous safety deposit boxes across the globe. Yet, despite decades of searching, no massive, centralized cache of Lansky wealth was ever conclusively discovered. This enduring mystery is the ultimate testament to his unique genius. He understood that the safest way to hide wealth was not to consolidate it, but to atomize it, to scatter it so widely and invest it so legitimately that it became indistinguishable from the background noise of the legitimate economy. The fortune was likely never a single hoard, but a diffuse network of assets. A piece of a Las Vegas casino, owned through 3 layers of holding companies. A silent partnership in a New York garment business. A real estate trust managed by a lawyer who asked no questions. Small, profitable ventures owned by his children and grandchildren, all operating independently and legally. Their criminal origins laundered through the simple, irreversible passage of time and the patina of legitimacy. His legacy, therefore, is not measured in dollars, but in the blueprint he created for modern financial crime. He was the pioneer who demonstrated that violence was a tool for the simple-minded, that true, enduring power was derived from the quiet, patient manipulation of capital and the systematic corruption of institutions. He professionalized the American underworld, dragging it out of the era of street, level brawls, and into the corporate age of board meetings and profit sharing agreements, the multi-ethnic corporate model of organized crime that he and Lucky Luciano engineered became the template for every sophisticated criminal enterprise that followed. From the international drug cartels to the cyber criminals of the digital age, all of whom learned Lansky's primary lesson: the ledger is more powerful than the lead pipe. His influence seeped into the very fabric of 20th century America, shaping the development of Las Vegas, influencing American foreign policy towards Cuba, and forcing the creation of new laws and new government agencies like the Reichseo Act and sophisticated financial intelligence units, specifically designed to combat the kind of systemic, white-collar criminality he perfected. And yet, for all his notoriety, the man himself remains an enigma, a series of contradictions. He was a devoted family man who ordered the deaths of rivals, a Jew who funded the early defense efforts in Israel while partnering with men who had collaborated with the Nazis, a ruthless criminal who was described by those who knew him as soft-spoken, polite, and fiercely loyal to a small circle of friends. He lived in the gray areas, in the shadows where the clean world of finance met the dirty world of crime. And he navigated that space with an unerring sense of direction. The story of Meyer Lansky is the story of the American dream viewed through a distorted funhouse mirror, a narrative of an immigrant who used his intelligence and ambition to rise to the pinnacle of power, but who did so by operating in a world devoid of morality, where success was measured solely on a balance sheet. He proved that the system could be beaten, not by smashing it, but by understanding its rules better than its creators, and by exploiting its inherent vulnerabilities with a cool, dispassionate precision. His life stands as a permanent, chilling reminder that the most dangerous criminals are not those who break the law, but those who learn to manipulate it so skillfully that they become invisible, their power woven so deeply into the economic and political landscape that it becomes impossible to root out. The search for Meyer Lansky's millions may have ended, but the echo of his methods, the ghost of his financial architecture, continues to haunt the corridors of power and the shadowy realms of the global underworld, a silent, enduring monument to the little man who figured out how to win the game without ever seeming to play. To truly comprehend the phenomenon of Meyer Lansky, one must venture beyond the chronological timeline of his life and delve into the very psyche of the man, to explore the foundational principles and the unique moral vacuum that allowed him to operate with such detached efficiency in a world drenched in violence and betrayal. He was in many ways the ultimate pragmatist, a man who had stripped away all conventional notions of good and evil and replaced them with a single, unwavering metric utility. This worldview was not formed in adulthood as a convenient justification for his crimes. Its roots were planted in the fertile, traumatic soil of his childhood in Grodno, where he witnessed firsthand that the institutions designed to protect people, the church, the state, the law, were not merely fallible, but were often the very instruments of their oppression. This early lesson in systemic corruption was absolute. It taught him that morality was a luxury, a narrative constructed by the powerful to control the weak, and that the only real things in the world were power and survival. When his family arrived in America, he did not see a land of liberty and justice for all. He saw another system, albeit with different rules, where power was still the primary currency. And he set about acquiring it with the same single-minded determination a scholar might apply to mastering a difficult language. His genius lay in his ability to apply pure, unadulterated logic to a sphere of human activity, crime, that was traditionally governed by passion, pride, and territorial impulse, while his colleagues were driven by a desire for respect, by flashy displays of wealth, or by the visceral thrill of violence. Lansky was driven by the elegant, silent satisfaction of a perfectly balanced equation, the orchestration of a complex bootlegging operation, the mathematical certainty of a casino's house edge, the intricate layering of a money laundering scheme. These were to him not crimes, but complex puzzles to be solved, and the profit was simply the proof of a solution, well executed. This is why the betrayal and murder of a lifelong friend like Bugsy Siegel, while undoubtedly a source of profound personal grief, was also a logical necessity. Siegel had become a variable that threatened the stability of the entire equation. His emotional profligacy and financial mismanagement introduced an unacceptable level of risk into a system that Lansky had spent decades calibrating for maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. The decision to sanction his friend was, in Lansky's cold calculus, no different than a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb to save the body. It was a tragic but necessary procedure to preserve the health of the larger organization. This emotional detachment was his greatest armor and his most potent weapon. It allowed him to sit across a negotiating table from a corrupt senator or a brutal dictator like Batista and speak their language of power and mutual benefit without the burden of conscience or the liability of personal animosity. He was never feared for his temper, but he was deeply respected and universally dreaded for his judgment, because his colleagues knew that his decisions were never made in anger or spite, but were the result of a dispassionate analysis of the facts. This made him more reliable than a hot-headed Sicilian capo, but also far more dangerous, as there was no appeal to mercy or past friendship once his mind was made up. His relationship with his own Jewish identity was similarly complex and pragmatic. He was not a religious man in the traditional sense, but he was fiercely tribal, operating on the old world principle that trust was safest within one's own community. This led him to surround himself with a loyal cadre of Jewish associates, men like Doc Stacher and Mo Sedway, who formed the financial and strategic core of his operations, a group that journalists would later dub the Kosher Nostra. Yet, this same man could form a decades-long, immensely profitable partnership with Lucky Luciano and later with figures from the Genovese crime family, because ethnicity was, in the end, just another variable in the equation. If the numbers worked, the partnership was viable. His reported financial contributions to the Havana, the Jewish paramilitary organization that fought for the establishment of Israel, are often cited as a redeeming feature, a nod to his heritage. But even this act can be viewed through the lens of pragmatism. It was an investment in a potential future haven, a strategic diversification of his political assets, and a way to forge connections with a new class of powerful figures in a nascent state. There was no conflict in his mind between funding a Jewish homeland and simultaneously partnering with men whose associates had done business with the Nazis. These were separate ledgers, different calculations for different outcomes. Meyer Lansky was the human embodiment of a Swiss bank vault, secure, impersonal, and designed for a single purpose. His inner life locked away as securely as the fortunes he was rumored to have hidden. He did not see himself as a villain, nor did he likely spend any time wrestling with the moral weight of his actions. In the perfectly ordered universe of his mind, he was simply a businessman, a master logician operating in a world he correctly perceived as being fundamentally immoral, playing the game by the only rules he had ever believed in, the rules of survival and profit. His legacy, therefore, is not just a blueprint for financial crime, but a chilling case study in the power of pure, unadulterated reason when it is completely divorced from the restraining influence of human empathy and ethical consideration. The operational genius of Meyer Lansky was not confined to a single brilliant insight or a fleeting moment of criminal innovation. It was a consistent, daily practice of meticulous strategy and risk management that transformed the chaotic impulses of the underworld into a disciplined, corporate enterprise. To understand the sheer scale of his administrative mind, one must picture the countless moving parts of his empire at its zenith, a vast and intricate machine humming with silent efficiency. Every day, reports would flow in from across the country and from the Caribbean, ledgers from the Cuban casinos, balance sheets from the Las Vegas interests, profit statements from the National Wire Service, and cash tallies from the remaining numbers rackets and illicit loan, sharking operations in major cities. This torrent of raw financial data would land on his desk, either literally in a secure office or figuratively in a series of clandestine meetings. And it was here that Lansky performed his alchemy. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to absorb these vast columns of numbers, to cross-reference them against his mental map of the Syndicate's expenses, which included everything from construction costs and payroll for legitimate employees to massive, regular payouts to corrupted officials and legal defense funds for indicted associates, and instantly identify discrepancies, inefficiencies, or opportunities for growth. He was known for his phenomenal memory, rarely writing anything down, keeping the entire financial structure of a multi-million-dollar criminal consortium in his head. A living, breathing database of illicit commerce. This was a necessary security precaution, of course, but it was also a reflection of how he viewed the world. The numbers were the reality, and everything else was mere noise. His management style was the antithesis of the flamboyant, public gangster. He did not hold court in smoky nightclubs or demand obsequious respect from underlings. Instead, he operated like the chairman of a corporate board, presiding over meetings that were models of order and decorum. He would listen more than he spoke, allowing his partners, the often volatile and egotistical heads of various crime families, to voice their opinions, complaints, and ambitions. Then, with a quiet, measured tone, he would synthesize the discussion, steer it towards a consensus that aligned with his long-term financial goals, and allocate resources with the precision of a general deploying troops. He was a master of conflict resolution, not through mediation, but through the impartial authority of the balance sheet. If two factions were disputing a territory, Lansky would not necessarily side with the stronger or the more loyal. He would analyze which allocation of that territory would generate the highest net profit for the syndicate as a whole, and his decision, backed by the irrefutable logic of increased revenue for everyone, was almost always accepted. This financial impartiality gave him a unique and unassailable authority. He was the neutral arbiter whose judgments were perceived as being in the collective financial interest, and this prevented countless internal wars that would have otherwise crippled the organization. His personal security was managed with the same dispassionate logic. Unlike Al Capone, who traveled with a large, visible retinue of bodyguards, or Bugsy Siegel, who reveled in his celebrity, Lansky was a ghost. He employed a small, intensely loyal, and highly discreet security detail. But his primary defense was his anonymity. He understood that the most effective armor was to be unknown, to be underestimated, to be the quiet man in the corner that no one noticed. He avoided photographers, gave no interviews, and cultivated a public persona of a boring, retired businessman. This was a deliberate and brilliantly executed strategy. By minimizing his public profile, he minimized his value as a target for rivals, and more importantly, reduced the incentive for law enforcement to make a spectacle of his arrest. He managed the Syndicate's public relations by ensuring it had no single, recognizable public face, and in doing so, he protected not only himself, but the entire enterprise from the kind of media-fueled scrutiny that had ultimately brought down so many of his predecessors. This extended to his personal habits. He was not a heavy drinker, nor a womanizer, nor a gambler in his own casinos. He understood that vices were points of vulnerability, loose threads that an investigator could pull to unravel a life. His only real indulgence was his family, and even this was compartmentalized, kept in a world separate from his business dealings, a sanctuary of normalcy that he fiercely protected. In the end, the day-to-day reality of Meyer Lansky's power was not one of glamorous parties and dramatic confrontations, but rather one of endless meetings, mental calculations, and strategic patience. It was the power of the spreadsheet, the power of the silent partnership, the power of the long-term investment. He was the central processing unit of the American underworld, coolly and relentlessly executing the complex program he himself had written, turning the raw, violent chaos of street crime into a stable, enduring, and horrifyingly profitable institution. The relentless pressure applied by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department in the early 1960s forced Meyer Lansky into a strategic defensive posture. A long and draining war of attrition that would test the limits of his financial ingenuity and personal fortitude. This period marked a profound shift from empire building to a complex and perilous mission of preservation, a high-stakes game where the primary objective was no longer profit, but survival against an adversary with virtually unlimited resources and the full authority of the state. The government's strategy was multifaceted and relentless. It was no longer enough to catch Lansky in a specific criminal act, for he was too insulated, too careful for that. Instead, the plan was to systematically constrict his world, to sever his connections, and to financially suffocate him by making the movement and concealment of his assets so perilous that the machine would seize up from within. The FBI's surveillance was not merely observational. It was a form of psychological warfare, a constant, visible reminder that there was no privacy, no safe haven, no conversation that was not potentially being recorded. Federal agents became a permanent feature of his landscape, parked outside his home, following his car to the grocery store, visibly taking notes at the restaurants where he held his few remaining meetings. This omnipresent scrutiny had a chilling effect on his operations, as even the most loyal associates grew nervous about being seen with him, fearing that their own legal vulnerabilities would be exposed by mere association. The loss of Cuba had been a catastrophic financial blow, but this legal siege was an assault on his entire operational methodology. He could no longer easily convene the Syndicate's board, could no longer move money through his established channels without the high probability of it being traced, and could no longer trust that the walls did not have ears. His response was a masterclass in strategic retreat and adaptation. He began to rely even more heavily on a small, trusted inner circle, often communicating through his wife, Thelma, or through his longtime attorney, Moses Polikoff, using the shield of attorney, client privilege as a final bastion of confidential communication. He divested himself of any asset that had a visible connection to him, a process likened to dismantling a complex watch and scattering its components to the winds. Businesses were sold to front men for a pittance. Properties were transferred through a daisy chain of shell corporations that stretched from the Bahamas to Panama, and vast sums of cash were physically moved and hidden in ways that defied conventional tracking. It was during this time that the legend of the Meyer Lansky treasure truly began to grow, fueled by the government's own court allegations of his hidden hundreds of millions and his own public persona of a man of modest means. The reality was likely far more complex than a single hidden treasure. It was a network of dormant assets, silent partnerships, and investments in the names of his children and grandchildren, all designed to be activated or accessed at a future date when the heat had died down. This process of dissolution was, in its own way, as brilliant as his process of creation. He was methodically erasing his own financial fingerprint, knowing that the government could not convict him for a fortune it could not prove existed. The strain of this decade's long siege was immense, etching itself into his health. The heart condition that would eventually claim his life was worsened by the constant, grinding pressure. The failed attempt to seek refuge in Israel was a desperate gamble. A final attempt to find a jurisdiction beyond the reach of his American pursuers, and its failure was a devastating blow, both personally and strategically. To be declared not a Jew by the very homeland he had supported was a profound and painful rejection that struck at the core of his identity. Forced to return to the United States to face trial, the subsequent not guilty verdict in 1973 was his last great victory, a final, stunning demonstration that his mind could still outmaneuver the colossal effort mounted against him. The government had thrown every resource it had at the problem of Meyer Lansky, and the jury, looking at the calm, elderly, and unassuming man in the courtroom, and the lack of any concrete, provable evidence of vast wealth, had concluded that the legend was perhaps just that, a legend. But the victory was hollow. The legal battles had consumed his resources and his energy. The empire was a phantom, the syndicate was fragmented, and his own life was reduced to its most basic elements. His final years were a quiet epilogue, a life lived in the shadow of his own myth, a king without a kingdom, a financier without a visible fortune, a genius who had perfected the art of survival, only to find that survival itself had become a form of imprisonment. The government may have failed to convict him, but in their relentless pursuit, they had succeeded in containing him, in reducing the most powerful criminal mind of his generation to a quiet, sickly old man in a Miami Beach bungalow, forever looking over his shoulder, his greatest creation, his own impenetrable legacy, now serving as his final and most isolated cage. The enduring enigma of Meyer Lansky's hidden fortune transcends mere curiosity and enters the realm of American folklore, a financial Bigfoot that has captivated treasure hunters, federal agents, and historians for decades, its elusive nature being the final and most perfect expression of his lifelong philosophy. The official probate of his estate, which cataloged a few tens of thousands of dollars in assets, was not a declaration of fact, but rather the opening argument in a posthumous debate that continues to this day. To accept the probate at face value is to believe that the man who taught the American underworld how to launder money, who built a financial apparatus sophisticated enough to challenge the resources of the United States Treasury, somehow forgot to provide for his own family's future beyond a paltry sum. This stretches credulity to its breaking point and ignores the fundamental principle that guided his every action: long-term planning. The prevailing theory among those who have studied his life most closely is not that the fortune was lost, but that it was successfully and permanently integrated into the legitimate economy, achieving a state of financial nirvana where illicit wealth sheds its criminal skin and is reborn as clean, generational capital. Imagine not a single buried chest of gold, but a diversified, self-sustaining portfolio of assets so thoroughly laundered by time and legitimate business practice that their origins are untraceable. This would include silent ownership in thriving businesses whose original seed capital had been washed through layers of holding companies, long-term real estate investments held in irrevocable trusts for his grandchildren, and perhaps even conservative stock market portfolios managed by discreet financial advisors who asked no questions. He understood that the ultimate goal was not to possess wealth, but to control it, and that control could be exercised just as effectively from the shadows through complex legal structures and implicit understandings as it could from a named bank account. The failure of the government to locate this fortune is a testament to his patience. He was playing a game that extended beyond his own lifespan, sowing financial seeds that were designed to bear fruit for his descendants, not for himself. This concept of intergenerational planning was his masterstroke, a final middle finger to the authorities who hounded him to his grave. The money did not need to be accessed in his lifetime. In fact, it was safer if it wasn't. The very act of trying to spend it would have created a paper trail, so he lived modestly, acting the part of the broke old man to perfection, all the while knowing that the foundation for his family's future had been laid in cement and was quietly accruing value beyond the reach of any prosecutor. This strategy required an immense personal sacrifice, forgoing the lavish lifestyle that his peers flaunted. But for Lansky, this was a trivial price to pay for ultimate victory. His legacy, therefore, is not just in the criminal techniques he pioneered, but in this philosophical approach to wealth itself. He demonstrated that money is most powerful when it is invisible, when it works silently in the background, shaping events and securing futures without ever announcing its presence. The countless books, articles, and documentaries dedicated to uncovering his secrets have all, in their own way, failed to provide a definitive answer, and this failure is his final triumph. He created a mystery that is, in all likelihood, unsolvable by design. The scattered fragments of his empire were like pages from a book written in a code that only he understood, and when he died, the code died with him. The fortune, if it exists in a centralized form, is not a static pile of cash, but a living, breathing entity that has evolved and grown over the decades. Its Lansky DNA diluted with each passing year until it is now indistinguishable from any other old money trust fund. To search for it is to chase a ghost, to try and grasp smoke. The true location of Meyer Lansky's millions is not in a secret Swiss vault or a buried container in the Nevada desert. It is in the very system he manipulated, woven into the fabric of the American economy itself, a silent, permanent monument to the little man who proved that the greatest power lies not in possession, but in the profound and unshakable knowledge of how to make the world itself your hiding place. The profound and unsettling legacy of Meyer Lansky extends far beyond the dusty archives of organized crime history, casting a long and indelible shadow over the very structure of modern illicit finance and the ongoing, often futile, struggle of governments to contain it. He was the original architect, the visionary who first mapped the blueprints for turning violent, street-level criminality into a smooth, multinational corporate enterprise, and his models and methods have been studied, adopted, and refined by every major criminal organization that has emerged in the decades since his death. The drug cartels of Mexico and Colombia did not simply traffic in narcotics. They established sophisticated financial networks, used front companies to launder billions, and corrupted government officials at the highest levels, operating with a corporate hierarchy that would have felt intimately familiar to Lansky. The Russian oligarchs who plundered their nation's wealth after the fall of the Soviet Union did so by creating Byzantine corporate structures that stretched across multiple jurisdictions, obscuring ownership and moving capital with a brazen efficiency that was pure Lansky in its execution. Even the modern cybercriminals who operate from anonymous server farms, draining digital wallets and extorting corporations with ransomware, are his spiritual heirs. They have simply replaced his physical wire services and casino counting rooms with encrypted dark web markets and cryptocurrency tumblers. But the underlying principle remains identical. Find an unregulated or poorly understood space, exploit it with technical precision, and create a system to launder the proceeds until they are clean. Lansky's genius was in recognizing that the future of crime was not in stronger men with bigger guns, but in smarter men with sharper calculators. He professionalized violence, treating it not as an expression of passion, but as a calculated business expense. a tool of corporate governance to be used sparingly and strategically, much like a hostile takeover in the legitimate business world. This corporatization of crime made it far more resilient, stable, and profitable, and it forced governments worldwide to fundamentally rethink their approach to law enforcement. The very legal tools that were eventually developed to combat these kinds of sophisticated criminal enterprises, such as the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, in the United States, were direct legislative responses to the model Lansky pioneered. The entire global framework for combating money laundering, with its requirements for suspicious activity reports, customer protocols, and international cooperation between financial intelligence units exists as a massive, multi-trillion-dollar defensive wall built specifically to counter the strategies he first implemented with such stunning success. In a very real sense, the modern anti-money laundering industry is a monument to the threat he represented. His life forced a reluctant establishment to acknowledge that the greatest threat to the system was not from outside, but from within, from those who learned to manipulate the system's own rules and mechanisms for their own ends. This is his most enduring and chilling contribution. He demonstrated the inherent vulnerabilities of capitalism itself, showing that its mechanisms for moving and legitimizing capital could be hijacked by those with the intelligence and the lack of scruples to do so. He proved that the line between a brilliant financier and a brilliant criminal financier was often vanishingly thin, a matter of perspective and legal technicality rather than fundamental method. The quiet, unassuming man in the modest home was, therefore, not an anomaly, but the very archetype of the modern threat, the enemy who does not look like an enemy, the revolutionary who wears a suit and carries a briefcase instead of a flag and a gun. His story is a permanent cautionary tale about the limitations of power, about how the most sophisticated surveillance and the most determined prosecution can be thwarted by a mind that is always thinking several steps ahead, that plans not for the next quarter, but for the next generation. The world has moved on. The technologies have changed. The specific rackets have evolved. But the fundamental principles laid down by Meyer Lansky, the primacy of financial control, the strategic use of corruption, the corporate structuring of illicit enterprise, and the patient, long-term laundering of wealth and legacy remain the foundational tenets of high-level criminality. He is the ghost in the machine of global finance, a permanent reminder that the most dangerous ideas are not those that break the rules, but those that learn to rewrite them entirely from the shadows, leaving behind a mystery that can never be fully solved and a legacy that can never be entirely erased. To isolate Meyer Lansky's story as a singular anomaly in the criminal world is to misunderstand its true significance. His life was instead a dark reflection of the American century itself, a narrative deeply intertwined with the nation's economic ambitions, its foreign policy misadventures, and its complicated relationship with morality in pursuit of power. He did not operate in a vacuum, but rather exploited the specific opportunities presented by a rapidly modernizing America, a country grappling with its own identity as a global power while struggling with internal contradictions. The Prohibition era, which launched his career, was a period of profound national hypocrisy, where a constitutional amendment designed to enforce morality instead created a black market of staggering proportions, effectively bankrolling the very criminal elements it sought to suppress. Lansky was simply the most astute businessman to recognize this official schism between law and public desire, and he built his initial empire squarely in the gap between them. His subsequent expansion into Cuba was not merely a criminal enterprise. It was a perfect mirror of American neo-colonial ambitions in the Caribbean during the post-war period. Just as American corporations exerted immense influence over the economies of Latin American nations, Lansky and his syndicate became the shadow counterpart, using the same tools of economic leverage and political corruption to secure their own tropical paradise. His partnership with Batista was a microcosm of the United States' Cold War strategy, where alliances were forged with unsavory authoritarian regimes in the name of combating communism, turning a blind eye to their corruption and brutality. Lansky was, in effect, a private sector embodiment of this realpolitik, understanding that anti-communism was a currency just as negotiable as cash, and that his lucrative operations would be tolerated as long as they aligned with the broader geopolitical interests of the American government. When Castro's revolution succeeded, it wasn't just a mobster who lost his empire. It was a stark symbol of the failure of that very policy, a populist uprising that rejected both American corporate influence and the mob's parasitic gambling dens in one sweeping gesture. The relentless pursuit of Lansky by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department in the 1960s also reflected a broader cultural shift. It was part of the Kennedy administration's New Frontier, a conscious effort to project an image of youthful vigor and moral cleansing, to tackle the entrenched, shadowy powers that had been allowed to fester. Lansky, the hidden king of this shadow world, became the ultimate trophy, a symbol of everything the new administration promised to eradicate. His ability to evade them for so long, and his ultimate acquittal, was not just a personal legal victory, but a demonstration of the deep, resilient roots the Syndicate had planted within the American system itself. His life story forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that organized crime was not an alien infestation on the American body politic, but a malignancy that grew from within, fed by the country's own appetite for vices, its systemic corruption, and its relentless pursuit of wealth. He was, in his own twisted way, a hyper-efficient capitalist, applying the principles of corporate mergers, market monopolization, and vertical integration to an illegal industry, and in doing so, he revealed the dark, a moral engine that can drive capitalism when it is completely unmoored from ethical constraints. The American dream promised that through intelligence, hard work, and ambition, anyone could rise from nothing to immense success. Meyer Lansky fulfilled that promise to the letter, but he did so by holding a funhouse mirror up to its ideals. proving that the same energy and innovation that could build legitimate empires could also construct criminal ones of breathtaking scale and durability. His journey from the pogroms of Russia to the inner sanctums of power is a perversion of the immigrant's success story, a warning that the opportunities of a free society can be exploited by those without a moral compass. He is not an exception to the American narrative, but a central, haunting character in it, a man who used the system's greatest strengths, its economic freedom, its fluid social structures, its relentless drive for growth, against itself, creating a legacy that questions the very foundations of the system he so brilliantly manipulated. To study Meyer Lansky is to not just study a gangster, it is to study the hidden costs of ambition, the corrupting nature of unchecked power, and the unsettling truth that the line between a visionary businessman and a criminal mastermind is often drawn not by their methods, but merely by the legality of their chosen market. The human cost of Meyer Lansky's meticulously calculated empire, often obscured by the compelling narrative of his financial genius and strategic brilliance, forms a vast and silent tapestry of suffering that stretched from the slums of American cities to the sun-drenched streets of Havana, a dark counterpoint to his legendary ascent. For every dollar that was seamlessly laundered through a legitimate business, there was a human being who had been broken in the process, a life extinguished, or a family terrorized to ensure the smooth operation of the machine. The violence he orchestrated was never personal, but it was devastatingly absolute, a necessary function of corporate governance in a world without courts of appeal. The murder of Bugsy Siegel, while a logical business decision, left a family fatherless and severed a bond of brotherhood that had lasted since childhood, a personal tragedy that was merely an entry in a ledger of calculated risk. Beyond these headline-making executions lay a deeper, more pervasive layer of human wreckage. The illegal gambling rings that funded his early ventures preyed upon the desperation of the poor, trapping them in cycles of debt and despair. The loan sharking operations, which provided crucial liquidity for the Syndicate, were engines of intimidation and fear, their collectors employing brutal tactics to ensure repayment, shattering knees and lives with dispassionate efficiency. The brothels that fell under the Syndicate's control were prisons for countless women, their lives and bodies commodified to generate revenue for an organization that viewed them as expendable assets. And in Cuba, the glittering paradise of the Riviera and the National was built on a foundation of profound exploitation and corruption that impoverished the very soul of the nation. The vast profits that flowed from the casino tables into Lansky's coffers were siphoned from a Cuban populace living under a brutal dictatorship that his money helped to keep in power. The political corruption he expertly managed in the United States, the judges and police officers and politicians on his payroll represented a slow, burning poison in the veins of democracy, eroding public trust and perverting the course of justice for generations. For every official who took a bribe to look the other way, a community was left more vulnerable. a criminal was left to prey on the innocent, and the idea of a fair and impartial system was further undermined. The addiction, the broken families, the lives lost to the vices he so profitably peddled. These were not unfortunate side effects. They were the essential raw materials of his industry. Lansky's great psychological achievement was his ability to remain willfully blind to this human collateral damage, to abstract suffering into a simple line item of operational expense. He never saw the grieving widow of a rival he had ordered eliminated. He saw a potential liability that had been neutralized. He never saw the gambler who lost his life savings at a Lansky-owned table. He saw a favorable statistical outcome in the house's edge. This capacity for emotional distance was the key to his longevity, but it also reveals the profound moral emptiness at the core of his project. He built an empire not in spite of the human cost, but precisely because he was willing to ignore it, because his definition of success was purely financial and strategic, utterly divorced from any ethical consideration. The legend of the quiet, cerebral businessman thus carries with it a chilling subtext that the most efficient and dangerous criminal is not the one who revels in violence, but the one who is so focused on the bottom line that he becomes entirely numb to it, who sees human beings not as souls with inherent worth, but as variables in a grand and profitable equation. The search for his hidden millions, therefore, is not just a hunt for treasure. It is, in a symbolic sense, a search for the ghosts of all those who were crushed beneath the weight of his ambition, the invisible and unacknowledged creditors of a fortune built on a foundation of silent suffering. The true cost of Meyer Lansky's empire can never be calculated on a balance sheet, for it is measured in a currency of stolen lives, broken spirits, and a corrupted system, a debt that was never paid, and a shadow that still lingers long after the accountant himself has turned to dust. The final years of Meyer Lansky's life, following his acquittal in 1973, were a study in profound isolation and the heavy burden of a myth he could no longer control. A slow motion descent from the pinnacle of shadow power into the mundane realities of frailty and oblivion. The man who had once moved millions with a whispered instruction now spent his days in a small, rented house on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach, a world away from the opulent suites of the Riviera or the private rooms of Manhattan's most exclusive clubs. The constant, grinding surveillance that had defined his later years largely evaporated after the trial, not out of respect, but because the government had finally conceded defeat. He was no longer considered an active threat, but a relic, a closed case file to be stored away. This hard-won peace, however, was not liberating, but rather a form of quiet erasure. The phone, once a direct line to the levers of power, now rang infrequently, its calls limited to family and a dwindling number of old, wary associates. The stream of financial reports and strategic consultations dried up, replaced by the silence of a retired life he had never planned for and did not desire. His health, always precarious, deteriorated steadily under the weight of a failing heart and emphysema, the physical manifestations of a lifetime of immense psychological pressure. He became a ghost haunting his own neighborhood, a frail, elderly man taking short, labored walks, recognizable to a few but known to none, the legendary little man, now reduced to his literal physical stature. This forced anonymity was the ultimate irony of his life. He had achieved his goal of becoming invisible to the law, but in doing so, he had also vanished from the world he once ruled. The empire he built was either dismantled, co-opted by a new, less disciplined generation, or lying dormant in the hidden trusts he had created, its activation now beyond his reach. He was like a master architect who could no longer enter the building he designed, able only to hear vague rumors of its condition from the outside. The myth of his fortune, which he had so carefully cultivated as a defensive measure, now became a source of powerlessness, as every interaction was shadowed by the unspoken question of the missing millions. He could not enjoy a modest dinner at a local restaurant without speculation, swirling about the true purpose of his outing. He could not receive a visit from his son without whispers of secret instructions being passed. The legend had taken on a life of its own, and he was now merely its custodian, a prisoner of his own reputation. There are no records of him expressing regret or introspection in these final years. His was not a temperament given to public confession or philosophical musing. His focus remained, as it always had, on practicalities: his health, his family's well-being, and the preservation of his story as he wanted it told. He cooperated cautiously with a few writers, not to atone, but to shape the historical narrative, to ensure that his legacy as a brilliant strategist would outlast the government's portrayal of him as a mere gangster. But even this was a defensive, rear-guard action. The true power, the power to command, to allocate resources, to shape events from the shadows, was gone, leaving behind a vacuum that was filled by the creeping mundanity of old age. His death in 1983 from lung cancer was not a dramatic event, but a quiet conclusion. The final fading of a signal that had once broadcast on a frequency only the powerful could hear. The subsequent probate of his estate, which revealed such startlingly modest assets, was the final, confounding chapter of his public story, a punchline that left everyone, the government, the public, his former associates, unsure whether to feel cheated or outsmarted once more. In the end, Meyer Lansky did not just die, he performed his own disappearance, leaving behind a corpse and a mystery, ensuring that the conversation would not be about his death, but about the enigma of his life and the phantom fortune that symbolized it. His final victory was to make his own end as ambiguous and untraceable as his financial transactions, leaving the world to forever wonder if the quiet, broke old man in Miami Beach was the real Meyer Lansky, or if the real Meyer Lansky was the brilliant ghost who had already slipped away, his work finally complete, his greatest secret hidden not in a vault, but in plain sight. The intricate and often contradictory relationship Meyer Lansky maintained with his Jewish identity forms a critical and deeply layered subtext to his entire life story. A thread that wove through his personal actions, his business partnerships, and his ultimate perception of himself as an outsider operating within and against a system that had never fully accepted him. His identity was not a matter of religious observance. He was thoroughly secular throughout his life, but rather a profound, tribal sense of belonging and a keen, historically informed understanding of persecution and the precarious nature of safety for Jewish people. This worldview, forged in the pogroms of Grodno, was reinforced by the casual but pervasive anti-Semitism he encountered in America. Even within the upper echelons of the criminal underworld, while he formed his historic partnership with Lucky Luciano and worked seamlessly with Italian mobsters, he was acutely aware that the old world Sicilian mafia families, the Mustache Petes, would never fully admit a Jew into their inner sanctum. This reality was a key driver behind his creation of a powerful Jewish syndicate, a group of trusted, brilliant minds like Doc Stacher and Mo Sedway, who operated as his inner financial cabinet. This Kosher Nostra was more than a business alliance. It was a survival mechanism, a declaration that in a world of inherent distrust, his deepest loyalties would always lie with those who shared his cultural and historical baggage. This instinct for self-preservation within a hostile world explains what is perhaps the most complex and debated aspect of his life: his financial support for the fledgling state of Israel. In the years following World War II, Lansky became a significant, though secretive, funder of the Havana, the Jewish paramilitary organization that would become the backbone of the Israeli Defense Forces. He used his network to facilitate arms deals, channeling weapons and, more importantly, vast sums of money to the cause. This was not a simple act of philanthropy. It was a multifaceted strategic move. On one level, it was a genuine, deeply felt connection to the idea of a Jewish homeland, a safe harbor from the kind of persecution that had defined his childhood. It was an emotional investment in a future where his people would never again be stateless victims. On another, more pragmatic level, it was a classic Lansky operation, a strategic diversification of assets and influence. Israel represented a potential new base of operations, a country with a sympathetic government that might, in the future, offer him refuge from his American pursuers. It was also a way to launder his reputation, to attach his name, however privately, to a heroic national struggle rather than a sordid criminal one. This duality is the essence of the man. He could simultaneously be funding the creation of a Jewish state while his business partners in the Italian mob were dealing with known fascists and Nazi collaborators. There was no moral conflict in his mind because these were separate ledgers, different calculations for different objectives. His attempted emigration to Israel in 1970 under the law of return was the logical culmination of this lifelong strategy, a final, desperate attempt to cash in on this long-term investment. The Israeli Supreme Court's rejection, declaring that a person of his criminal character did not qualify as a Jew under the law, was arguably one of the most devastating blows he ever suffered. It was a profound rejection that struck at the core of his self-perception, telling him that the homeland he had supported considered him not a son, but a stain. This ruling forced him to confront a painful truth that despite his power, his wealth, and his cunning, in the eyes of many established institutions, he would always be the other, the gangster, the unacceptable element. His Jewishness, which had been a source of internal strength and a basis for his most trusted alliances, was ultimately wielded as a weapon to exclude him. This final, stateless chapter of his life completes the tragic arc of his identity, a man born into persecution in Russia, who built a fortress of power in America only to be hounded by its government, and who was then denied sanctuary by the very nation he helped arm, leaving him forever the outsider, a king without a country. His brilliant mind ultimately trapped by the very labels he had spent a lifetime trying to transcend. The psychological portrait of Meyer Lansky that emerges from the totality of his life and actions is not that of a classic sociopath, devoid of all human connection, but rather that of a man who constructed a formidable intellectual fortress around a core of deeply suppressed emotion. A master of compartmentalization who could segregate the brutal necessities of his business from the tender affections of his family life with an almost superhuman discipline. He was capable of genuine love and fierce loyalty, particularly toward his children and his second wife, Thelma, with whom he built a stable and seemingly normal home life, a deliberate sanctuary insulated from the violence and corruption of his professional world. He was known as a devoted father who provided his sons with a comfortable, upper-middle class upbringing, encouraging their education and steering them emphatically toward legitimate careers, a clear indication that he saw his own path not as an aspiration, but as a necessary, if successful, damnation. This ability to maintain a warm, functioning family unit while simultaneously orchestrating a vast criminal enterprise required a profound splitting of the self, a psychological mechanism that allowed him to be, in essence, two different people. The loving husband and father coexisted with the cold-eyed strategist who could calmly authorize the murder of a lifelong friend because the numbers demanded it. There is no evidence he ever confessed his professional life to his family or sought their understanding. That part of his existence was locked away in a separate room of his mind, its door sealed shut when he came home. This compartmentalization extended to his personal code of ethics, which was entirely self-constructed and situational. He did not see himself as an evil man in his own estimation. He was a realist operating in a world that was inherently corrupt, a businessman providing services that people wanted, liquor during Prohibition, gambling in Cuba, and efficiently managing the complex organization required to deliver them. He possessed a personal sense of honor, fiercely loyal to those who were loyal to him, and scrupulously honest in his financial dealings with his partners, believing that his word, once given, was binding. This twisted integrity was what made him so trusted and reliable within the Syndicate. His colleagues knew that if Lansky said the profits would be split a certain way, they would be without deceit or short-changing. Yet this personal code existed entirely within the bubble of his criminal fraternity and did not extend to the outside world. which he viewed as a predatory ecosystem not unlike the one he operated. The law was not a moral authority, but a set of arbitrary rules to be navigated, and the government was not a legitimate entity, but a larger, more powerful rival corporation. This worldview allowed him to corrupt police, judges, and politicians without a flicker of conscience. He was not undermining justice. He was simply negotiating a better business environment, paying a fee for operational convenience. The profound tragedy of Meyer Lansky lies in this very dichotomy. He was a man of immense personal control, discipline, and a unique brand of honor who channeled all these formidable traits into the service of an utterly immoral enterprise. He applied a genius-level intellect to solving the problem of how to commit crime more efficiently, how to launder money more thoroughly, and how to corrupt systems more completely. Had he been born into different circumstances or chosen a different path, his talents for organization, mathematics, and strategic planning could have made him a legendary captain of industry, a groundbreaking economist, or a formidable military strategist. Instead, those same talents were directed toward building a shadow empire, leaving behind a legacy that is both awe-inspiring and horrifying. He was not a man without feeling, but a man who had successfully imprisoned his own feelings in the service of his work, becoming the perfect, dispassionate engine for a machine that fed on human weakness and suffering. In the end, the fortress of his mind became his own prison, isolating him not only from the consequences of his actions, but from the full spectrum of his own humanity, leaving behind the enigma of a man who could calculate the flow of millions across continents, yet could not, or would not, calculate the moral cost of the empire he built. The physical and operational world that Meyer Lansky constructed for himself was a masterclass in deliberate anonymity, a carefully curated landscape of unremarkable locations and controlled interactions designed to render him invisible to all but the most necessary few. He was a ghost in the machine of his own making, and his genius for secrecy extended to every facet of his daily existence, from the cars he drove to the restaurants he frequented. Unlike the flamboyant Al Capone, who reveled in public attention, or the charismatic Lucky Luciano, who cultivated a reputation as a celebrity gangster, Lansky embraced the persona of a mid-level businessman, a man whose life was so ordinary it was beneath notice. His offices, to the extent he had them, were not opulent suites but modest, unmarked rooms in otherwise nondescript buildings, their locations known only to a handful of trusted lieutenants. The famous meetings where the fate of the national criminal syndicate was decided did not take place in grand halls, but in quiet corners of diners, on park benches, or in the back rooms of social clubs, places where the comings and goings of men would attract no special attention. He was a creature of habit, but his habits were deliberately bland, a form of protective coloration that allowed him to blend into the background of everyday American life. He favored dark, conservative suits, drove unassuming American sedans, and maintained a residence that was comfortable, but far from the lavish estates his wealth could have afforded. This was not an act of austerity, but a critical security protocol. He understood that ostentation was a beacon, drawing the unwanted gaze of both rivals and law enforcement. By living modestly, he reduced his profile, making himself a harder target for both assassination and prosecution. His travel was equally discreet. He moved without fanfare, avoiding the use of flashy entourages, often using intermediaries to book his travel and accommodations under assumed names. His communication network was a marvel of clandestine engineering, relying on a complex system of pay phones, messages passed through trusted couriers, and conversations held during walks in public parks where electronic surveillance was more difficult. He was a master of the unrecorded conversation, understanding that the most dangerous evidence was not a fingerprint or a photograph, but a recorded voice authorizing a criminal act. This operational security extended to his financial dealings, which were a labyrinth of intermediaries. He rarely held property or bank accounts in his own name, instead using a rotating cast of front men, lawyers, and family members to act as the public face of his investments. This created a buffer of plausible deniability that was often impenetrable. When questioned by authorities, he could truthfully state that he did not own a particular casino or corporation. The complex web of trusts and shell companies did the owning for him. His entire life was a performance of normalcy staged for an audience of potential investigators, a continuous and exhausting act designed to convince the world that there was nothing of interest to find. The constant federal surveillance he endured in his later years was, in a perverse way, a testament to the effectiveness of this strategy. The government knew he was powerful, but they could never quite find the lever of that power, the tangible asset or the recorded confession that would bring him down. They were forced to watch a man who appeared to do very little, who lived a quiet life, and who yet, they were certain, commanded a vast and hidden empire. This was the ultimate expression of his power, the ability to project powerlessness. The most dangerous place for Meyer Lansky to be was in the spotlight, and so he perfected the art of living in the shadows, not as a skulking figure, but as a bland and uninteresting one, a man whose greatest trick was to make the world believe that the most powerful criminal of his era was, in fact, no one special at all. The enduring fascination with the location of Meyer Lansky's fortune is a cultural phenomenon in its own right, a modern-day treasure hunt that says as much about our collective imagination as it does about the man himself. This obsession transcends the mere curiosity about wealth. It represents a deep-seated desire to solve the ultimate puzzle he left behind, to find a tangible, satisfying conclusion to a story defined by ambiguity and intellectual triumph over seemingly insurmountable forces. We are captivated by the idea of a secret vault, a numbered Swiss account, or a buried chest because it offers a clean, narrative ending. The discovery, the reveal, the final accounting. The reality that the fortune was likely systematically dissolved and integrated into the legitimate global economy is a profoundly unsatisfying anticlimax. It denies us the catharsis of a final scene where the map is rid and the treasure is uncovered. This is why the legend persists in more romantic forms, tales of gold bullion secreted in the Nevada desert, of safety deposit boxes in Zurich under assumed names, of offshore holding companies so perfectly constructed that they remain dormant and undiscovered. We imagine a detailed ledger, perhaps in a locked briefcase, that holds the key to it all, a final testament to his genius. This search is not just for money, it is for validation. To find the fortune would be to prove that the government was right all along, that the modest estate was indeed a grand con, and that the system, in the end, could be beaten. It would be the ultimate evidence of his criminality, but also the ultimate proof of his brilliance. The fact that it has never been found, despite the efforts of the FBI, the IRS, and countless private investigators and journalists, only adds to the mythos. It fuels the suspicion that he won, not just in the courtrooms during his life, but in the historical record after his death. The mystery also serves as a Rorschach test for our views on wealth, power, and justice. For some, the missing millions are a symbol of the inherent corruption of the system, proof that the truly powerful can operate with impunity and never face a true reckoning. For others, it is a thrilling underdog story, a narrative of a single individual outsmarting the colossal machinery of the state. The fortune has taken on a symbolic weight far greater than its monetary value. It is the ghost in the machine of American capitalism, a permanent reminder of the hidden currents of illicit wealth that flow just beneath the surface of our legitimate economy. We see its echoes in every political corruption scandal, every revelation of massive tax evasion, every complex scheme uncovered by financial regulators. Lansky's ghost haunts these stories because he was the original architect, the man who wrote the playbook. The search for his money, therefore, is also a search for the hidden wiring of our own world, an attempt to pull back the curtain on the secret mechanisms of power. And so the hunt continues, not because anyone realistically expects to find a pile of gold with Meyer Lansky's name on it, but because the possibility, however remote, keeps the story alive. It allows us to believe that the most carefully laid plans might still have a flaw, that the perfect crime might still leave a clue, and that the quiet, unassuming man from Miami Beach might yet, from beyond the grave, have one last secret to reveal. The greatest trick Meyer Lansky ever pulled was not convincing the world he didn't have a fortune. It was convincing the world that finding it would actually matter, ensuring his legend would remain forever entangled with the tantalizing, unanswerable question of where he hid his gold. The intellectual inheritance Meyer Lansky bestowed upon the world of illicit enterprise is perhaps his most profound and disturbing legacy, a curriculum of crime that has been studied and expanded upon by every sophisticated criminal organization that followed, transforming his personal methodologies into a global standard for operating in the shadows of the legitimate economy. His core innovation was the conceptual shift from viewing crime as a series of discrete, violent acts to understanding it as a continuous financial operation, where the act of generating illicit revenue was only the first, and in many ways the simplest, step in a much longer and more critical process. He was the first to treat money laundering not as a mere ancillary task, but as the central nervous system of the entire criminal organism, without which the organism would quickly succumb to its own toxic waste. This philosophy, that the clean exit strategy is more important than the profitable entrance, has become the foundational principle for modern transnational criminal syndicates. The Colombian cartels of the 1980s and 1990s, for instance, did not merely excel at smuggling cocaine. They mastered the art of placement, layering, and integration on a global scale, using everything from front companies exporting legitimate goods like cement or flowers to complex schemes involving international trade finance to repatriate their billions. They were applying the Lansky model with a different commodity, but the financial architecture was eerily familiar. Similarly, the rise of post-Soviet organized crime in the 1990s was a case study in Lansky's principles, as oligarchs and gangsters used the chaos of privatization to loot state assets and then funnel the proceeds through a dizzying array of shell companies in Cyprus, the Channel Islands, and Switzerland, effectively stealing entire sectors of an economy and legitimizing the wealth abroad. These modern criminals did not need to have read a biography of Meyer Lansky. They were operating in a financial ecosystem that he had helped to shape, where the tools for obscuring wealth had become more accessible and more sophisticated. His influence is even more starkly visible in the digital age. Cybercriminals who execute ransomware attacks or drain cryptocurrency exchanges are the direct philosophical descendants of the young Lansky, who saw prohibition not as a law, but as a market opportunity. They identify a vulnerability, often a poorly defended digital infrastructure, and they exploit it with technical precision. But their real challenge, just as it was for Lansky, is not the theft itself, but the laundering of the proceeds. The emergence of cryptocurrency mixers, privacy-focused coins, and decentralized finance platforms represents the natural evolution of Lansky's shell companies and layered bank transfers. These digital tools create the same labyrinthine trails he once engineered with paper ledgers and corrupt bankers, all designed to achieve the same end, the dissociation of wealth from its criminal origins. Furthermore, the corporate structure he imposed on the American Mafia, with its clear divisions of labor, its profit-sharing agreements, and its board of directors-style governance, has been adopted by criminal organizations worldwide, from the Yakuza in Japan to the drug cartels of Mexico, all of which have evolved beyond simple, hierarchical families into complex, multinational businesses with diversified portfolios. By demonstrating that crime could be corporatized, Lansky made it more resilient, more scalable, and infinitely more dangerous. He proved that a well-managed criminal enterprise could have a longer lifespan and a greater impact than any single government administration tasked with destroying it. His legacy, therefore, is not a static set of techniques, but a living, adaptive philosophy of illicit power. That violence is a management tool, not a purpose. That corruption is a strategic investment. That liquidity and anonymity are more valuable than physical assets, and that the ultimate victory is not achieved through fear, but through the silent, patient, and irreversible integration of illicit wealth into the bloodstream of the global economy, where it becomes impossible to ever remove. Every time a new financial secrecy haven is discovered, or a complex trade-based money laundering scheme is uncovered, we are witnessing another chapter in the textbook that Meyer Lansky wrote. A chilling reminder that the most dangerous ideas are those that empower others to replicate your success long after you are gone. The ultimate and most poignant tragedy of Meyer Lansky's long and tumultuous life may not have been the loss of his Cuban empire, the relentless legal persecution, or even the personal betrayals, but rather the profound and inescapable isolation that became the price of his own success, a loneliness that grew in direct proportion to the expansion of his power and the perfection of his secrecy. In his early years on the Lower East Side, his world, though violent and precarious, was one of vibrant, chaotic human connection. The fierce loyalty of his partnership with Luciano and Siegel, the bustling, teeming energy of the streets, the shared ambition of a small band of brothers fighting for their piece of the world. As his intellect and his operations grew more sophisticated, this world necessarily shrank. Trust became the rarest and most dangerous commodity, and every relationship outside of his immediate family became a potential calculation of risk versus utility. The murder of Bugsy Siegel, a man he had loved like a brother, was the symbolic point of no return, the moment the last vestiges of uncalculated friendship were sacrificed on the altar of corporate necessity. From that point forward, his inner circle grew smaller and more guarded, comprised of men bound to him not by youthful camaraderie, but by financial interdependence and a shared understanding of the rules of his cold, logical universe. The constant surveillance of his later years acted as a final, oppressive barrier, ensuring that even these remaining connections were strained and conducted under the watchful eyes of federal agents. He became a man trapped in a fortress of his own design, the walls built not of stone, but of ledgers, shell corporations, and unspoken truths. The legendary fortune, if it existed as a centralized entity, would have been not a source of comfort, but another isolating burden, a secret so immense it could never be shared, a truth that would have to die with him. One can imagine the immense psychological weight of such a knowledge, the inability to ever speak freely, to ever boast of one's achievements, to ever seek genuine counsel or comfort. His public persona, the carefully maintained image of the modest, retiring businessman, was a prison of anonymity. He could never enjoy the fruits of his labor in any public way, could never receive the recognition his intellect deserved, even from the illegitimate world he helped to build. He was forced to watch as lesser men, louder and more violent men, became the public faces of the syndicate he financed, while he remained in the shadows, the ghost at the banquet. His attempted flight to Israel was, in this light, not just a strategic maneuver, but a desperate, final grasp for a community, for a place where his identity and his history might grant him acceptance. and a measure of peace. The Israeli Supreme Court's rejection was thus a sentence of permanent exile, a confirmation that there was no community for him, no sanctuary, no place where he could simply be Meyer Lansky again. He returned to America not as a conquering hero or a feared king, but as a stateless ghost, a man without a country, without a community, and with ever-dwindling human connections. His final years in Miami Beach were the logical conclusion of this journey into solitude. A small house, a failing body, and a silence broken only by the whispers of a legend he could no longer control. The very skills that had ensured his survival, his secrecy, his distrust, his emotional detachment, had rendered him incapable of achieving the simple human connections that are the fundamental currency of a meaningful life. He had mastered the world of numbers, but had become a stranger to the world of people. His death, therefore, was not just the end of a life, but the closing of a circle that began with a young boy seeking power to escape persecution and ended with an old man who had acquired that power only to find it was the most effective instrument of his own isolation. The fortune, the notoriety, the legend, all of it amounted to a kingdom of one, a terribly quiet and lonely empire where the only subject was the king himself, and the only sound was the echo of his own brilliant, calculating thoughts in the immense and empty vault of his mind. The story of Meyer Lansky does not conclude with his death or with the final balance of his probated estate. Instead, it resolves into a permanent and unsettling question mark over the nature of power, success, and the American dream itself, a legacy that continues to provoke, fascinate, and disturb because it challenges the very definitions we use to measure a life. He is the paradox that will not be neatly solved, the ghost in the machine of American history whose presence is felt whenever we consider the hidden architectures of power that operate just beyond the spotlight. To label him simply a gangster is to ignore the corporate executive who managed a multinational enterprise. To call him a businessman is to whitewash the brutality and corruption that funded his ventures. To see him as a failed man who died with little is to miss the profound success he achieved in his primary goal of evading the consequences the state sought to impose upon him. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable fluidity between the criminal and the capitalist, between the innovator and the exploiter, between the dream of immigrant success and the nightmare of its immoral realization. He is the dark counterpart to the Horatio Alger myth, proving that the same intelligence, ambition, and relentless work ethic that can build a legitimate empire can also construct an illegitimate, one of staggering scope and durability. And that society often draws the line between the two not based on method, but on the legality of the market being exploited. The endless search for his fortune is, in a deeper sense, a search for moral clarity in his story. We want to find the money because it would provide a tangible verdict, proof that he was, in the end, a greedy criminal who hoarded his loot. The far more disturbing possibility is that the fortune was never meant to be found, because it was never stored in that way, that his true victory was not in accumulating wealth, but in perfecting the process of its transformation and integration, a process that continues to this day in the countless trillions of dollars that are laundered through the global financial system annually. He demonstrated that the most subversive and powerful act is not to rob a bank, but to own one, or better yet, to so thoroughly understand its mechanisms that you can make it work for you without your name ever appearing on a single document. This is why his story remains so critically relevant. In an era of unprecedented wealth inequality, of shell companies and anonymous trusts, of cryptocurrencies and digital assets that defy national borders, the world has, in many ways, finally caught up to Meyer Lansky's vision. The tools for obscuring wealth and operating in the shadows are now more accessible than ever, and the philosophical questions his life raised about the relationship between wealth, power, and morality are more urgent than ever. He stands as a permanent warning about the vulnerabilities of our systems and the potential for their exploitation by those with the intellect and the absence of scruples to do so. He is a lesson in the limitations of raw power, proving that even a genius who commands the loyalty of thousands and the corruption of governments can be ultimately defeated by the simple human need for connection and a place to call home. The final image of Meyer Lansky is not of a powerful king or a broken prisoner, but of the lonely old man on the park bench, the master of the universe who mastered everything except the art of being truly known, the architect of a shadow empire who became a ghost in its corridors, his greatest secret not the location of his gold, but the profound and empty silence that lay at the heart of his own spectacular, tragic, and terrifyingly brilliant triumph.